Hello there and welcome to episode 2 of Blues Truths, the impromptu podcast I decided to make that is kind of half media review, half diary. Now if that sounds really weird, it's because it absolutely is. Anyway, on today's episode I'll be looking at the 2002 anime series Azumanga Daioh. Now, to give some context on Azumanga Daioh, this is a show that resides in the slice of life genre, and now this isn't a genre that's unique to anime, most certainly not, but to give some details on what this consists of, it's basically what it says on the can, it's just a show that depicts a bunch of characters going through their day-to-day life. And these shows are often characterized by the fact that they're quite laid back, rather relaxing, and just a very pleasant experience where you can kind of tune into these shows and just sit back, relax, and enjoy what you're seeing. Now, understand that from an outsider's perspective, this sort of show can seem almost pointless in a way, because a lot of people watch media in the sense that it gives you a feeling of escapism. You watch these great grand dramatic tales of a bunch of people teaming together to save worlds, or other forms of melodrama. So what's the point of watching a show that just so accurately depicts day-to-day life? And for me personally, I find a lot of relaxation in this. There's something great about being able to come back from a stressful day of work, or in my case studying, because of course I'll be studying at university. How else would I have the time to make a shitty podcast like this? But there's something so nice about being able to come back from a stressful day and just tune into this rather relaxing show that's quite low drama, and it's just nice and pleasant, and this show is very much like that. It doesn't have much of a plot to speak of. It's just these, this group of friends hanging out in high school. But even though on a surface level this can sound rather simple, it's so much more than that. It's very much a character piece more than anything else, because while these characters that, you find in the show, a lot of them can be defined as cliches. You've got this energetic character, Tomo, as well as the sort of straight man counterpart to that in Yomi. At least I think that's how you say her name. I hope that's how you say her name. And despite the fact that all these characters can kind of be defined in one sentence, the show over time tends to go to great length to sort of show more shades of grey to these characters. It shows their insecurities, especially with a character called Chiyo, who is one of the more iconic characters in the series. She's this sort of child prodigy that managed to be in high school despite her young age, just because of the fact that she's so damn smart. And I remember my first time watching the show thinking that this is quite unrealistic. I was thinking to myself, 12-year-old me watching this was thinking, how the hell can someone be so smart that, they end up in high school despite their young age? Then, coincidentally, I've now met someone that's gone through that exact same process, so hey, clearly it's very possible. I just didn't know about it then. But anyway, with this character, this show could easily fall into a sort of trapping that I've seen with other shows when they're dealing with this kind of character. She could come across as just flawless and quite pompous and annoying, but instead the show goes to a great deal to show that, she is very human, she is very realistic, because it shows a lot of, not necessarily flaws, but a lot of her own personal fears and her own personal failures. Not only does it show the fact that she is quite uncomfortable in this, older setting, that of high school, but also shows that she's not very good at sports, and she isn't quite the perfect person that you would first expect to see on the surface level. And it's quite nice, this. And I especially love the fact that all these character interactions feel so real and natural. This feels like a true group of friends that you could actually see at a high school that you've been to, because what is often the case with these sorts of anime high school shows, especially ones that have this sort of comedic, slant to it, and Azumanga Daioh is very much a comedy show, I'll go into that later, but the fact of the matter with most of these shows is that just a lot of these characters don't feel like people that you would see hang out with each other in a friends group. It just feels like a bunch of people that are being forced together for the sake of a script to derive comedic situations out of something. And with this show, that is not the case. It just, all of their personalities rub off each other so well, and it feels like they truly do have a lot of affection for each other, and very much like each other too. A very good example of this happens in a scene that for some reason has stuck with me for so long now, because last time I watched the show, the whole way through was about 7 years ago, so despite the fact that I have quite a hazy memory on a lot of scenes, quite a bit of hazy recollection, this scene has stuck with me a great deal. And this is a sequence where it's one of the more quieter moments in this show, where Yomi is in her room studying at her desk, and then Tomo kind of comes in through the window, I believe. And instead of this sort of like bizarre, angry reaction, Yomi just kind of turns around and is like, oh, it's you. Well, you know, I'm going to be doing my work, so just be quiet and let me do my thing, you know, something like that. I'm obviously paraphrasing to a big degree here. So the scene kind of just plays out with Tomo lying down in this bed while Yomi does her work, and it just goes to show what their dynamic truly is. Because on a surface level, you see them as these childhood friends that just bicker constantly, because like I said, Tomo is that massive playful personality that is just energetic all the time, while Yomi is very serious and very straight at times. But in the sequence, you can see that there truly is a bond there, because they're so comfortable in this moment. Yomi is just so comfortable with Tomo appearing in her room randomly, you know, and they're both comfortable in the silence, and it takes knowing someone for a long time to be so comfortable about a scenario like that. Especially in the case of me, I can't handle being in silence with someone unless I have a very, you know, deep relationship with them. And it's sequences like this that they go beneath the surface of the characters and show something quite real and quite lovely. And I remember reading this article one time that said that each character in Azumanga Daioh feels like someone that you personally know, like they all feel like a friend that you've known before, and this is so true, and it just goes to show how much painstaking detail has gone into portraying these very ordinary people, and it's so wonderful, you know. And I keep on stressing a great deal about the characters because this is just the centerpiece. Like I said, there's not much of a plot going here. It's just a show that shows the growth of these people and their really fun, funny interactions with each other, and it's just it's such a joy to behold. And one of my personal favorite characters is that of Asaka, and she might even be my favorite character on the whole entire show. She's this sort of very spaced out personality. She's not in the moment all that often, and a lot of the comedy for her derives from the fact that she has these crazy daydream sequences, you know. She's constantly imagining all these bizarre scenarios in her head, and it creates these very surreal comedic sequences. I'm not going to do it justice here, but I remember one in particular where she is zoning out in class and she imagines that Chiyo, you know, that child prodigy character I mentioned before, she imagines her taking off each pigtail kind of like it made that noise, and I apologize for anyone listening to this for hearing me make weird lip sounds, but anyway, let me continue on here. So she sees Chiyo just take off these pigtails, put them in like a box, and then take out two more and place them back on, and it's just, I think the scene went like that, but it just illustrates that getting this insight into Asaka's mind brings out these very ludicrous scenarios that are always a joy to see, and that's a lovely thing about the comedy in this show, because like I said before, this is a very funny show. In fact, despite slice of life, the main genre I would categorize this show as is that of comedy, because it's funny, and it's like consistently funny on an episode to episode basis. One of the few shows that makes me laugh with almost every episode, which is quite rare, well, for me personally at least. Clearly I'm just a hard to please arsehole. Whoa, that sentence, oh god. If someone just took that soundbite out, they could use it against me heavily. Whoops. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, the show is genuinely funny, but the wonderful thing about the comedy in this show is the fact that it's very character specific, you know, because I'll give an example using the character of Sakaki, because to give some context onto her character here, she's this very sort of stoic, serious-looking character on the surface. Everyone sort of views her as this person that gets into all these fights and is very almost rough in a way, but as the show goes on, you start to get insight into personality, and you learn that she's actually quite a bit of a softie. She's just very shy and has this sort of, I don't know, scary-looking exterior. And it's funny because she quite often gets these like marks on her hand, these bites, from the fact that she just really desperately wants to pat this cute neighborhood cat. But from an outsider's perspective, from people in a classroom, they see her walking into class, these like bandages on her hands, and they think to themselves, oh my god, like, she must get into all these very serious fights. And it's a sense of comedy that comes from the fact that you know this character well. And it's so nice having comedy in a show that is character specific and is not only funny, but also reaffirms character detail. It's nice and it's quite clever. It's not just throwaway zany jokes, because quite a lot of the time with anime, a lot of the jokes are just things like, oh look, it's a random zany scenario, haha, laugh at this. No, these jokes feel more planned out and more meticulous, and this is also the case with the pacing. The pacing is wonderful. At times it can come across as maybe a bit slow because it takes its time with the jokes, but it just means that the payoff is it's well earned, to say the least. It's consistently well done. It's actually based off a 4-panel manga, so a lot of the comedy pacing derives from that also, and the backgrounds play into this too, because they don't necessarily play into the comedy, but they play into the core idea that this is just a character-based show, because the backgrounds are quite stark, they're quite simple. I mean, usually it would just be like something akin to that of a one-colour gradient, and this is absolutely fine, because while the backgrounds aren't the focus, the characters very much are, and they have these fluent movements. It's not necessarily the most incredible, groundbreaking animation that you ever see, but it does its job, and it complements the comedy very nicely, and they have a lot of very exaggerated, crazy movements, and it helps out a lot of the scenes, this sort of exaggeration, for sure, and the soundtrack fits with the show masterfully, to say the least. There's a lot of variation in the instruments. Sometimes you have a brass instruments playing, sometimes you have a bit of ukulele. It always fits the scenario that's happening on screen, because sometimes the soundtrack would be rather zany and just fun, but sometimes it'll also be rather slow and almost melancholic in a way, which is quite strange when reflecting on the soundtrack, because sometimes I'll listen to a track and I'll find myself almost feeling rather sad, and I think this fits into a core theme of the show, which is that of nostalgia and reminiscence, because earlier I mentioned that not many people can see a worth in watching a slice of life show, because I mentioned that a big argument for it is, what's the point of watching a show that reflects real life when I can just sit back and watch something more dramatic and more fun? And I think a large reason that it's so popular is that because as someone that's left high school, you can watch these shows and get a nostalgic sense for a time that's now been lost. And the show does that perfectly. It feels like a series of flashbacks involving a group of people that were once really great friends. And there's almost a sort of sad tint to it if you view it that way, which sounds melodramatic, I know, but it only adds more to the show for me personally. And like I said, the soundtrack plays into that. It has its quiet moments, it has its zany, fun moments, and also has some really beautiful, just low-tempo stuff in there. It's consistently good. It's not always noticeable, which I think is fine. It plays into the background very well. I am making this show out to be more dramatic than it really is, though, and I'll circle around in a second and go back to the true core of what the show is, but I have to also mention the final 2 episodes, because they are also quite sad as well, and the show doesn't go out of its way to be sad in these final 2 episodes, because these episodes depict the graduation of the characters, when the characters are now moving on from their high school lives and going down their different paths. The show doesn't portray this as this very overly melodramatic thing where there's all these soppy flashbacks like most other contemporary shows might do. It depicts it in a very real, ordinary way, but as a viewer, because you've become so accustomed to these characters and their interactions and their very specific dynamics, and because you've learnt to fall in love with their crazy antics and the scenarios they get themselves into, it's hard not to watch this and feel almost somber in a way. It's quite... what's the right word here? It's very bittersweet. I think that word perfectly, I should say, not purposely, but I think that word perfectly encapsulates these final episodes, because it is bittersweet, but it's also very real and quite heartwarming in a way too. It doesn't end on this big dramatic note, which would be out of place in a show like this. Because while I'm talking about this show in these very dramatic, over-the-top terms in this, this past minute or so, overall, it is just a fun, comedic experience, and it's a great thing to just kind of sit back, relax, and watch. So if you're a fan of good character work, good comedy that actually makes you laugh, and you just like watching something that is quite laid back and consistently enjoyable, then I think that this show is definitely a must watch. It's one that's stuck with me for a very long time. Whenever I think back on it, I have very fond memories. And speaking of memories to do with the show, now this is the part of the podcast that I've been looking forward to, because this show made quite a big impact on my life back when I first watched it, which is when I was 12 years old. Now, hold on, let me scratch my nose here because I am a true professional. Hold on a sec. Anyway, as I was saying, to give some context here, the first time I watched this show was when my family and I were staying in Indonesia for a week, specifically Bali, of course, because we're a bunch of Australians. Where else do Australians go on holiday? Anyway, so we were staying at this sort of villa in Bali, and now they had this TV there. They had Foxtel, so you had an assortment of different channels, and my sister at the time was very much into anime. I mentioned this briefly in the last episode. She was a massive anime fan, and I wasn't into it at the time. I just thought that it was lame and stupid and weird, and I couldn't get into it, but she kind of had more control over the remote than I did, so every now and then she would switch to this channel called Animax, which I think is still running. It's just this channel that plays anime 24/7, I believe. Looking back on it, it's probably just the greatest thing, but at the time, every time she would switch this channel, I'd kind of be like, oh my god, here we go, more of these weird Asian cartoons. I'm not going to put up with this. But one time, she was watching Azumanga Daioh, just because it happened to be on. She had no prior knowledge of what the show was, and she was kind of just sitting there watching it, having a laugh. And at some stage, I found myself watching it too, and I got really into it. My sister and I had a big laugh, and I just thought that it seemed like a show that was a lot of fun. But I couldn't admit this, you see. I spent so long telling my sister that I hated these shows and that I wanted to watch my stuff. So I'd become quite a prude, and I couldn't let her know that I enjoyed it. So in secret, I decided to search up this show on my iPod. I believe I had an iPod second generation, or something similar to that at the time. Something that had the internet on it. So I was using the hotel Wi-Fi, and I tried to search up what the series was, because I had to see more. I enjoyed it that much. So in a rather coy way, without making it obvious that I was researching the show, I kind of asked my sister a question that was something along the lines of, what was the name of that stupid show we just watched? You know, very, very subtle, as it usually was with these kinds of things. And she just responded with, I think it was Azumanga Daioh. She said something like that. So instantly I Google this show, and I find out that it's based off a manga. And this excites me, because prior to watching this show, I'd been watching Family Guy, The Simpsons, American Dad, and all these animations that were for this older demographic. And I'd completely fallen in love with these. But I also love the fact that they seem to depict ordinary suburban life, and I love being able to relate to certain aspects of it, like the certain family aspects of it, but I couldn't relate to it 100% because these are very adult characters. So I've been looking for a piece of media that could reflect my life, and I was looking for something that I could relate to on a very personal level. And Azumanga Daioh just seemed to do this perfectly, because although I wasn't in high school like these characters were, as I mentioned, I was 12. I was in the latter stages of primary school. I was in grade 6, I believe. Yeah, grade 6 at the time, so I could still relate to a lot of these scenarios. These characters were closer to my age. And then finding out that this series is based off a manga, as someone who was a comic nut at the time, I was thinking to myself, oh my god, I have to find out more about this series. I have to read it somehow. So I find this website called Manga Rock, which is just this illegal manga scans website. I'm going to keep on switching between saying manga and manga. I can never decide which one I prefer using, so just prepare for that as a listener. Anyway, so I find this website that lets you legally read different manga. And I start reading through Azumanga Daioh. And it's funny because when I first reading through it, just going through the first few pages and being rather confused as to how this format works, because as people that have read manga before know, it's flipped. It's different. The way these comics are set out is different to how American comics are set out. Well, how Western comics, I should say, are set out. So it was quite funny trying to work out how this is going for the first time, but pretty quickly I work it out because somewhere on the website, it tells you how it works. It lets you know what's up. So I'm starting to read this and I'm having a good time already, just going through the first few pages. I'm thinking, wow, this is very funny. I'm already enjoying these characters. But then my auntie comes into the room, she says something like, "What are you looking at, Finlay?" And I instantly shit myself and just quickly shut off the tab because I'm so ashamed about the idea of people knowing that I like this series. Because not only was it an anime or a manga, it also mainly depicted female characters, and I felt almost insecure about this. I felt almost ashamed that I was becoming at the time, so into this show that was depicted the lives of these teenage girls. It wasn't this sort of normal macho man, robots bashing up against each other fair. It was just this very down-to-earth show that just happened to have female protagonists. But this is a point of contention for me. I couldn't let people know that I was into this. It was too embarrassing. I couldn't handle it. So as if I'm looking at porn or something disgusting on the internet, I close off this tab and I can't let her see what I'm doing. So for the rest of this trip, I don't read any more Azumanga Daioh. I don't even pretend to be interested in it, because it doesn't feel safe to me. I've got this auntie that's constantly asking me what I'm doing and I can't handle it. The stress is too much. Even though looking back at it, I'm sure if she did see what I was doing, if I just turned my phone and showed her that there was this manga on there, she'd probably just be like, "Oh, cool," and move on. But, to me, I was freaking out internally, which is just so ridiculous. Anyway, so we get back from this trip, and as soon as I get home, the first thing I do is go back onto Manga Rock, and I start going through each individual page of the first volume. And to give some more context here, what my parents used to do at night time, back when I was 12 years old, is they would turn off the internet. That way I couldn't stay up all night being on my iPod, like I most certainly would. If they ever accidentally left the internet on, that's what I'd totally do. So, knowing that I wouldn't have internet access later, I go onto each individual page of the first volume, or I do it for at least half the volume, and I screenshot pages myself. That way I can go onto my photo library and read them later. And I go through this very lengthy process because we're using Australian internet and it takes forever to load each individual page. If I'm just going through this process, making sure I don't spoil anything, make sure I don't read what's on there, and just screenshot each individual one. That way I can read it in secret with no one else disturbing me at nighttime. So this became sort of a personal routine for me where every night I would get really excited and I'd go into my room, I'd lock the door, listen out, make sure no one's around, and I'll snuggle up in bed and start reading through Azumanga Daioh. And it didn't... like I said, I kind of instantly fell in love with the show, but the more I read through the manga, the more I became obsessed with it, and it almost affected my life in a way. Because like I said, I couldn't tell anyone that I was into it. I thought that would be social suicide for me, and I especially couldn't tell my close friends, because although I said that my auntie wouldn't, give two fucks about the fact that I'm reading this manga, if my friends found out, they would most certainly make fun of me, so I couldn't let them know. But in a way, Azumanga Daioh was definitely bleeding into my day-to-day life, because I started giving my friends nicknames based off the characters, which is just fucking weird. And you think that this isn't very subtle, and that they would catch on that something's up, but they didn't really care. I'll just kind of be like, "Hey, your name's Tomo," and then my friend would be like, "Cool, I'll take it, why not?" But it also affected me in another way, in the sense that it kind of turned me into an OG weeaboo. A bit of a... oh god, I hate to admit this, and if anyone listening to this doesn't know what weeaboo is, it's this idea of like a Westerner being obsessed with Japanese culture and like forcefully trying to implement himself into it. It's really embarrassing, and it's very much a common thing, despite it being a bit of a cliche, bit of an internet cliche. But I kind of became this because at the time, my teacher, my grade 6 teacher, was teaching us Japanese because she was very much into the culture. So I became obsessed with this language. I was thinking, whoa, I gotta learn this too. And I remember one day I decide, this is it, I'm gonna become fluent. And I tell my parents, I say, I'm gonna learn Japanese. And they're like, oh, cool, okay, go for it. And then I get about halfway through the day and I give up, because who the hell has the motivation for that when they're 12 years old? But the show was kind of turning me into a bit of a weeb, which, oh god, I wish I wasn't admitting that, but it's very much true. Because this is my first time kind of getting this intimate insight into another culture. Because the manga has scenarios like it'll be New Year's or something, and it will show Japan's way of celebrating this. And at the time, this is exciting. I never really read something that showed another culture in such a very, I guess you could say, down-to-earth way, and it made me kind of obsessed with Japan for a while there. And it's quite funny looking back on it. I still absolutely adore Japan today, but at the time I started to have this very what word is that? I had this very intense fixation on it. And the series not only made me obsessed with Japan, it also made me obsessed with another kind of media that I just discovered, and this is fan fictions. Yeah, you heard me right. Fan fictions, because you see, I got so attached to this show. I had fallen so head over heels in love with it that when it ended, I couldn't really handle it, because I finished the manga, but that was all well and good. I felt a pang of sadness, but I was like, that's okay, I can just watch the series instead. And oh my god, the series appealed to me so much more. Seeing these scenarios play out with voice acting and animation and music was just, it worked so well, and I became addicted to secretly watching these episodes that I previously downloaded, of course, at night as well. And then after that show was finished, I couldn't handle it. Just that final scene where it shows all the characters going off on their separate paths, it made me so sad, and I desperately wanted to see more. And it's funny because I watched this Glass Reflection video. He's this like anime reviewer that I was really into back in 2014. I'm sure that his videos are still quite good. Haven't seen him in a while, but there was this video review he did on the series Clannad, where he talks about the idea of the void, which is this idea he talked about of being, well, not being, but feeling quite empty after watching a really good show, and feeling like you need to fill this empty void of a show quite similar. And I definitely had this. I felt a massive void after watching the show. I needed to fill it somehow. But instead of watching a similar show or finding something similar, I decided I'm gonna find a continuation, and I'll be damned if it's legitimate or official. So I went out of my way and discovered fan fictions, and at first I read this at the time I rather enjoyed it. I don't know if it holds up today, but it was just this sort of fan fiction that depict these characters being in college. It was quite nice, but it was very short. I think it only lasted about 3 chapters or so. So it didn't last very long, and I still had this hunger for more Azumanga Daioh content. So after reading this one, I distinctly remember discovering this sort of weird short story, and it was like this truth or dare scenario where all these characters are playing truth or dare of each other, and I was thinking, okay, this could be funny, maybe this will capture that comedy that I fell in love with so deeply. And oh no, this fanfiction most certainly wasn't that. And this is kind of my introduction to smut fanfiction, because it got weird. Like, they started getting dead to piss in buckets, and it kind of ended with this big, I got to what was basically the beginning of an orgy before being like, oh, this isn't the Azumanga Daioh I knew and I know and love. I had to quickly click out of that one. But shortly after, I discovered this series called Azumanga Daioh Returns, which might still be up there on the internet. And this one was quite odd, because I remember kind of discovering this later, but I feel like the author of this sort of created the self-insert character, because there's this male character that gets introduced early on who gets in a relationship with Sakaki, who's that character I mentioned before, who's like the sort of stoic, who has that stoic exterior while also being a real softy on the inside. And this male character gets in a relationship with her, and I remember the author later clarifying that he kind of used this character as like a portrayal of himself. So in a way, it's this sort of weird male fantasy series, but I didn't really understand it at the time. I just viewed it as a continuation, and at first it worked really well, because at first it still continued this sort of down-to-earth, realistic characters interacting with each other vibe, but then over time, I feel like the author got bored of writing that and wanted to shake it up a bit, because soon enough, these, like, evil organizations were being introduced. I remember one scene in particular where Chio was on this rooftop and nearly getting raped by, like, a gang of people, and then I think a fight scene broke out after that. I remember reading that section and being like, okay, this show's starting to... I wouldn't call it a show, but this fan fiction, I should say, is starting to get a bit odd. Like, he was adding in all these bizarre additional plot threads, and it was becoming a sort of perverted idea of what it originally was. So I kind of tapped out on that one, but I also distinctly remember skipping to the end of this series and just wanting to see where it ended up, and I came across this arc where each individual character had gotten pregnant somehow at, like, the same time, and that was the moment where I went, okay, I need to just stop with this. I need to kind of cut this fanfiction out of my life. And I most certainly did. I don't even know if it continued past this bizarre pregnancy arc, but I don't think it did. I'm not too sure. Maybe I'll have to check that out at some time when I'm feeling brave enough. But I had read all the fanfictions that I could find that I enjoyed, that weren't smut. And I'd also, read the manga, watched the series. So what was next? Well, next for me was just listening to the soundtrack, because I discovered on YouTube, when looking at these, like, Azumanga Daioh compilation clips, one of the songs just appeared on the sidebar, and a weird thing about me as a kid is that I wasn't really into music. Like, I'd have a song that I love, that I listened to occasionally throughout the year, but I never really was a big music fan. I didn't really listen to it in my spare time. I found it kind of boring. I didn't really have the attention span for this. But I fell in love with this series soundtrack big time. I used to kind of just play the music and imagine these scenarios in my head, because I became inspired by this series to try and create my own sort of animated comedy. So in my head, I'd create these different scenarios with all these characters based off friends I had in real life. And I listened to the soundtrack and imagine these characters in my head that I'd made up playing baseball or doing all these different activities. And this became a bizarre pastime of mine, where I would go into my room, making sure that no one else is there, listen to the soundtrack, and just pace around my room imagining these different scenarios. And I would eventually try to illustrate these as comics, but I mentioned in the last episode that I'm not very good at illustrating, so there's like these stickman scenarios. And I remember showing one of my close friends this. I was like, hey, I've made this series and the characters are based on us, and he was just kind of like, that's fucking weird, dude. So that kind of brought me back to reality, and it made me stop. And for a long time, I stopped being interested in this show, and I went back to feeling embarrassed about it. And I remember one time Googling, is it okay for guys to watch Azumanga Daioh? Because I felt so insecure about this idea, and it just came up with some, like, responses. Like, I remember reading one in Yahoo Answers where this person was inquiring because this chick wanted to show her younger brother Azumanga Daioh. She's like, is it okay for guys to watch this? And the responses were all, yeah, of course it is. It's the most harmless, fun show. Who cares? But, I still felt very insecure about this. So, after I'd gotten over the show, a few months later, I still found myself embarrassed about it. And I remember one time, I was just going through social media, and an image of the show just appeared. I'm not too sure what the context was here, but it was just an image of the characters, and instantly all these memories came flooding back, and it was this really surreal experience of me being like, oh yeah, this was a show that meant a lot to me once upon a time. And after I'd finished watching it, I forgot to mention, I also became very desperate with trying to communicate about the show to anyone, and this is my introduction to internet forums, because I found this website, I think it was called Wonderland Forums, where it was just dedicated to the show, and I think I was one of the few people that was still left on this website discussing it, but I was so desperate to talk about it, and I couldn't talk about it with anyone in real life, of course, I couldn't let them know. So I'd secretly message people in these forums, and it'll just be simple things like me saying, hey, Osaka is my favourite character, who's yours? These very sort of trite conversations, but it was quite fulfilling to me at the time. So anyway, I stopped watching the show, I'd cut it out of my life, and then I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw that photo, and it brought all these memories back to me, and it was quite a strange experience. And it wasn't until I got heavily into anime later on, this is when I rediscovered Spirited Away and all that. It wasn't until I got heavily into anime and I stopped giving a shit about what people thought that I became open about it. And I remember coming clean to my sister. I remember walking up to her one day and being like, hey, remember that time I said I hated that comedy show we watched in Bali? And she was kind of just like, yeah, I guess so. And then I come clean and I say, my ultimate confession, I go, yeah, I really loved that show. And her response is just, okay. Because of course she didn't care. Why did I create so much internal drama about this? It's so fucking strange looking back on it. For sure. But yeah, you know, I became very open about the stuff I was interested in. I'm still very much like that today. Obviously, no insecurities about this stuff anymore. I've grown past that, and if 12-year-old me could know that I'm currently staring at an Azumanga Daioh box set directly in front of me, he would be so shocked. He'd be like, what? You had the confidence to tell people about this? Your secret guilty obsession? You monster. But there's nothing to feel guilty about in terms of this show. Because it's just a really lovely series. And look, I will be recommending a lot of shows on this impromptu podcast I've been making, but some of these will be hard to get into. At one stage I'm sure I'm going to be talking about Doctor Who, and Doctor Who's quite a handful. There's hundreds of episodes, but I'm going to put it out there. Azumanga Daioh is one that's worth seeing. It's only 26 episodes, so if you have the time, I implore you to check it out, because hey, who knows, maybe you'll have as great an experience of it as I did. Just hopefully you'll be less stressed out about telling people that you enjoy it. So weird. Anyway, so yeah, that's the end of episode 2. Hopefully it wasn't too awful to listen to. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Enjoy. I'm still going to end these by saying, enjoy.